Welcome to Finding Holiness, where we delve into timeless Torah wisdom, revealing the sacred in everyday moments. Join us on a journey to elevate your spirituality and discover holiness in every aspect of life. I'm your host, Rabbi David Kadosh, and together, let's embark on a path of spiritual exploration. I hope you enjoy this next episode. Erev Tov, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the Finding Holiness podcast. We welcome you tonight for the first of two lectures on the laws of Matzah. We are less than 1 week away from the beginning of Chodesh Nisan. Our rabbis tell us already from the day after Purim, 30 days prior to the holiday of Pesach, do we start learning about the laws of Pesach. And here we are tonight, this evening, starting the laws of Matzah. Of course, Matzah being one of the major, if not the main mitzvah of the holiday of Pesach, as we'll soon see. But first, let's get to our sponsors. Tonight's shiur is sponsored by Mr. and Mrs. Moise Ben-Adid in memory of his dear father, Mr. Abraham Ben-Adid Zichrono Libracha, as well by Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Kislasi in memory of his grandfather, Mr. Chaim Kislasi Zichrono Libracha. May the words of Torah that we say this evening be lilu nishmatam tinafsham tura bitzror ha'chaim. As I was saying, there are two major biblical mitzvot on the holiday of Pesach. One of them being the eating of matzah, and the second one is Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the retelling of the story of the Exodus that we do on the night of Pesach, Leil HaSeder, and here in outside of Israel, Chutz La'aretz, we do that for 2 nights. But I want to focus tonight and next week, Bezrat Hashem, on the laws of matzah, not so much in terms of what we eat and the amounts that we eat on the night of the Seder, that I have given a class in the past, but more about the general idea of matzah, how they are made. We'll talk about a little bit between the differences between handmade matzah and shmura matzah, handmade matzah and machine matzah, the importance of shmura matzah, what exactly does it mean, and some other ideas that may be a little bit foreign to our audience tonight. The mitzvah of eating matzah, the information we're going to say tonight is based on the Sefer Peninei Halacha by R Eliezer Melamed, Shlita, one of the leading authorities in Halacha in the world, and a rabbi who I greatly respect based on his tremendous knowledge and insight in the world of halacha. The mitzvah of eating matzah, it's a Torah commandment to eat matzah on the night of the Seder, on the 15th night of Nisan. The Torah tells us, Ba'erev tochelu matzot. In the evening you shall eat matzot. Now, the Torah also tells us in a different place, Shiv'at yamim tochal matzot, that you shall eat matzah for 7 days. So the rabbis here, the Chachamim, inferred, based on rules of how to interpret Torah, and we're going to get to that shortly, that the Torah doesn't mean to command us that we must eat matzah for 7 days. We don't read the pasuk literally, Shiv'at yamim tochal matzot, that we eat matzah for 7 days. Rather, the intent, the kavanah of the pasuk is that matzah becomes the staple food that we eat on Pesach in lieu of bread. There's no bread, there's no chametz, so we eat mainly matzah. However, if a person doesn't want to eat matzah and he wants to live off fruits and vegetables and meat and yogurt and cheese, he may do so. He may do so on the rest of the days of Pesach. So what does exactly this mean? The simple meaning of this is that one who eats matzot all 7 days of Pesach does not thereby fulfill a mitzvah. And that's what the meaning, what the Chachamim said in the Gemara, in Masechet Pesachim, Daf Kuf Chaf Amud Aleph, that eating matzah is considered a reshut. A reshut means it's optional. So on the 7 days, it seems to be that it's a reshut. What's one way of interpreting this? Another way of interpreting this, according to many halachic authorities, who have written that although matzah is obligatory only at the night of the Seder, and indeed that's the reason why the Chachamim instituted the the special blessing over eating matzah at the Leil HaSeder. We see a special bracha of Asher Kideshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah. That only takes place at the Seder. Nevertheless, one who wants to eat matzah on the rest of the days of Pesach, on day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, would still fulfill a mitzvah, even though it's not obligatory. So one way of looking at it is you don't fulfill any matzah if you eat. You don't fulfill any mitzvah if you eat matzah on day number 6, or you could say no, you still fulfill a mitzvah, but it's just not obligatory. According to the second view, the second opinion, the Chachamim refer to eating matzah on the remaining days of Pesach as a reshut, optional, only by way of contrast that day number 1, the first night of Pesach, and again the first 2 nights in Chutz La'aretz, are a chiyuv, are an obligation to eat matzah. We have an obligation to eat matzah on the 15th day of Nisan, and here Chutz La'aretz as well on the 16th. According to this opinion, the pasuk of Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot, 7 days you shall eat matzah, it retains its very, very simple meaning. And that is how the Ibn Ezra, the Chizkuni, interpret the pasuk. This was the practice of the Vilna Gaon to even eat matzah, even on days 3, 4, and 5, you would still get a mitzvah. But they still maintained that receiving a mitzvah of matzah on day 3, 4, and 5 is only eating a kazait at each meal. You want to eat 20 kazetim of matzah, you're not going to get a mitzvah for every kazait that you eat on day 3, 4, and 5. You will get that on days 1 and 2 here in Canada or wherever you are celebrating your Seder. On the Seder, you will get a mitzvah for every kazait of matzah that you eat. I want to explain a little bit in depth how the rabbis were able to interpret this in one of the ways that we interpret the Torah. Every morning we recite in Korbanot the paragraph of Rabbi Ishmael Omer, Bishlosh Esrei Midot HaTorah Nidreshet, the 13 ways to expound the Torah. One of those ways reads like this: V'chol davar shaya bichlal, v'yatza min ha'kelal lelamed, lo lelamed al atzmo yatza, ela lelamed al ha'kelal kulo yatza. The Gemara Masechet Pesachim, again Daf Kuf Chaf Amud Aleph, based on one of its rules of interpretation, that any item that is singled out, we call that a prat. Any item that is singled out from a class of items, from a klal, does not leave the klal, does not leave the class of items to teach a new idea about itself. Lo lelamed al atzmo yatza, doesn't teach you a new idea of itself, but rather it applies the teaching to the entire class. So now, in this case, the class, the general, is Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot. You shall eat matzah for 7 days. There's one problem with that. Later on, the Torah gives us another verse. And there, the Torah tells us, for 6 days you shall eat matzot. Sheshet Yamim Tochal Matzot. Ubayom HaShevi'i Atzeret LaHashem Elohecha. And on the 7th day, it shall be a cessation for Hashem your God. Lo ta'aseh melacha, you shall not do any melacha. That's a pasuk in Sefer Devarim, the 16th chapter. So what do we see here? On one hand, we say 7 days you should eat matzah. And then another pasuk tells us that only 6 days you're eating matzah, day 7 not. What is excluded? The 7th day. The 7th day was excluded from the general class, that there's no mitzvah to eat matzah on the 7th day. So this in turn teaches us that the entire klal, the entire generalization, the class, all 7 days, that there is no mitzvah to eat matzah, except for the night of the Seder. Only on the night of the 15th, the Seder night, is there such a mitzvah. Why? The Gemara tells us because the Torah specifically explains and iterates, Ba'erev tochelu matzot. At night you shall eat matzah. So we learn from here that the only time you have a biblical obligation to eat matzah is the night of the Seder. Most Rishonim and Acharonim don't mention any mitzvah associated with eating matzah during the 7 days of Pesach, implying that there is no such mitzvah. However, there are still some that do actually mention the mitzvah. We mentioned the Ibn Ezra before and other Geonim, and they prove it from the fact that one does not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. The reason why we don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed is because tefillin represents a sign, represents an ot, ve'aya le'ot al yadecha. And whenever we already have another sign, then we don't wear tefillin, which is a sign. So Shabbat, for example, we don't wear tefillin because Shabbat is considered ot. Ot hi beni ubenechem. We say Shabbat, ki yesh mena Shabbat el ishmereni, ot hi le'ol me'ad. So we see Shabbat is an ot, so we don't wear tefillin. Chol HaMoed is also an ot. Why is an ot? What's the ot? The ot is the matzah. It says Ibn Ezra, we eat matzah even on Chol HaMoed. So according to Ibn Ezra, even Chol HaMoed, according to Ibn Ezra, even eating matzah during Chol HaMoed is considered a mitzvah, and that's the reason why we don't wear tefillin, so that not to wear two otiyot, two signs. So that is the general overview of the Torah and the Pesukim in the Torah on our obligations to eat matzah on the night. The only night that we are obligated to eat matzah, mina Torah, is the night of Pesach. However, many people hold, like we said, that if you still want to eat matzah afterwards, on day 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you will still get a mitzvah for every kazait that you eat. Next thing I want to talk about tonight is the concept of Matza Shemura. Shemura matzah. There is a mitzvah in the Torah to safeguard the matzot from becoming chametz. The Torah tells us 3 words: ushmartem et hamatzot, and you shall observe, you shall guard the matzot. And this refers specifically to the matzot that are eaten on the seder night in fulfillment of the mitzvah. Ba'erev tochelu matzot, like we mentioned, on the night you shall eat matzot, and those matzot need to be safeguarded. The other matzot that you eat on Pesach are like any other food. When I eat matzah on day 5, 6, or 7, they can be eaten as long as they don't contain any chametz, but they don't necessarily have to be shemura, the concept of shemura, which we're going to explain in detail now. But the night of the seder, the night of the sedarim, that's the 15th of Nisan or the 16th of Nisan, here in Chutz La'aretz, we have a special mitzvah, a special commandment to safeguard carefully the matzah that's going to be used and going to be eaten, and that is where the term Matza Shemura comes from. Primarily, the safeguarding of the matzot begins right when the wheat is harvested in the field. The moment they harvest the grain to be used for matzot, that is when the mitzvah of watching the matzot takes place. Common practice is to harvest the wheat while it's still a little bit moist, because if it was to dry out completely and then get drenched by the rain, it would become hametz. So likewise, the kernels of wheat must be stored in an area where there is no concern that it will come in contact with water, and hence there needs to be an extra level of protection. One is also able to fulfill the mitzvah of Matza Shemura, matzah that is safeguarded, with matzot that were guarded from the time that the wheat was milled into flour. We call that techina, tochen. Not the techina that you eat as a dip for your falafel, but it does mean the same thing. It's ground up. But nevertheless, that's what milled, when you mill the kernels into flour, that's the idea. That is a later stage than the harvesting. As long as the kernels show no signs of becoming chametz, and nothing happened to the kernels that would undermine the presumption that they are not chametz, then you don't have to be worried about it, and you don't have to be worried that they might become wet, they might become chametz, and therefore that would be Matza Shemura. However, this is not the best kind of Matza Shemura because it was only guarded at a later stage, at the stage of milling, and not at the stage of harvest. So, if you look at Shulchan Aruch in Siman Taf Mem Gimel Sa'if Dalet, he writes the following: Hachitim she'osim bahem matzat mitzvah. The wheat that you are going to use for the matzah that you're going to eat at the seder. Notice how he says the matzah that you're going to eat at the seder, matzat mitzvah. Tov leshameran shelo yiplu alehem mayim misha'at ketzira. It is very, very good that you make sure to watch this wheat, that water does not fall on them from the time of harvest. That's what he writes. Ulefachot misha techina, and at least from the time of the milling. Ubishat hadchak, and in very extenuating circumstances, mutar likach kemach min hashuk. You can even go buy flour from the shuk. When no flour, in those circumstances, when no flour has been guarded from even from the time of milling is available, then you can use regular store-bought flour and fulfill the mitzvah of at least guarding the dough while it's being kneaded. Even where it's customary to rinse the grain of wheat lightly before milling them, it's still permissible to buy regular flour in the market, because a brief rinse is presumed not to be enough to cause the grain to become hametz. But when the custom is to soak the grain in water, then one may not buy flour in the market since it's presumed to be hametz. So that's one of the issues with buying flour nowadays from the market or from the stores, that we don't know if the grain was indeed soaked prior, and therefore you have to make sure you buy flour if you are going to bake your own matzot, that you're going to buy flour that is kasher lePesach, because wheat is often soaked in water and may have become hametz. According to many Rishonim, the Rif, the Rambam, the wheat needs to be guarded, like we said, from the time of harvest. The Rosh, another Rishon, writes it's from the time of milling, because the mitzvah only begins when the wheat touches the water, and that only happens at the time of milling. It doesn't happen at the times of harvest, because the wheat was usually milled in water mills. So the Rosh, one of the Rishonim, like we said, his opinion is that as long as one mills the wheat without using water, the mitzvah of guarding the wheat doesn't take place, and it will only take place once you start kneading it. So that's the opinion of the Rosh. But again, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Shulchan Aruch, who follows the Rambam, says that it starts in the time of the harvest. The Tur and the Bet Yosef state that according to the Rif and others, the need to protect and guard the wheat for matzah only is with regards to the matzah that you're going to eat on the first night of Pesach. Like we said, Hachitim shosim bahem matzat mitzvah, for the purpose of the mitzvah that you're going to do. All other matzah that you eat on the holiday does not need to be Matza Shemura. And although there are many people that are stringent with themselves and they eat Shmura matzah for the entire Pesach, the entire holiday, either because they have concerns about the other matzot, maybe they're not meticulous in how they were baked, because it's made with flour and water, or because they feel that there's a mitzvah to eat matzah shmura all of Pesach. That's up to them. But nevertheless, according to halacha, you would need matzah shemura on the night of Pesach. And this is something that's very important. I like stressing to the listeners here tonight, audience, community members. Do your best on the night of Pesach to fulfill the mitzvah in the best way. Like we said, it's the one of two biblical mitzvot. Buy matzah shemura for the night of the seder. At least for the hamotzi part, the hamotzi lechem min haaretz and the ala chilat matzah. That first time you're eating matzah on the holiday, that should be matzah shemura. After that, you want to eat regular matzah, that's fine. But fulfill the mitzvah in the best way of ushmartem et hamatzot, that you eat matzah shemura when it comes to the matzat mitzvah on the night of the seder. In practice, today's minhag is to be very, very scrupulous about the shmura matzah, matzot that have been guarded from the time of harvest. And sometimes you'll see written on the box, Matza Shemura Mishat Ketzira, from the time of harvest. That's what we use to fulfill on the night of the Seder. And some people are so strict with this that if it doesn't say Bishat Ketzira from the time of harvest, they don't even consider it Matza Shemura at all, even though it is really Shemura halachically. And you can fulfill the mitzvah of Matzah regardless. But we want to try to be strict, especially that it's a biblical commandment. We know that whenever it comes to a mitzvah deoraita, a mitzvah from the Torah, we always try to act as strict as possible, so we know we fulfill the mitzvah according to all the opinions. Now, this idea of smura, of safeguarding, that actually has to come with some sort of kavanah. Now, I know many of us are not in the fields. and many of us don't actually go and bake the matzot. But there is an element of having proper concentration when this is done. The concept of ushmartem et matzot, safeguarding the matzot to be used for the fulfillment of the matzah for the mitzvah of Pesach, has two meanings. One, it could be we have to be extra vigilant, to prevent it from becoming chametz. And two, it could mean that we have to have the proper kavanah that the making of this matzah is for the purpose of the matzah, the mitzvah of matzah, leshem matzat mitzvah. Now, because of that, it's very, very necessary that the matzah be kneaded and baked by Jews who are halachic adults, meaning adult Jews, who can be relied upon to have proper kavanah and intent for the sake of the matzah mitzvah. According to this, you cannot have non-Jews baking your matzot. You cannot have minors, Jewish children, baking matzot. Or you cannot have mentally unfit or unstable people baking your matzot, because they cannot be relied upon to have the proper kavanah, to have the proper intent. But some people dispute the second meaning. In their view, the mitzvah of guarding the matzah requires just extra vigilance to prevent matzah from becoming chametz. That's what it means. But not that matzot are baked with extra intent. So according to this opinion, the Gentiles are allowed to bake matzot, and minors are allowed to bake matzot. They're allowed to knead. They can make the matzah, as long as you have an adult Jew that is supervising their work, ensuring that they're doing it quickly, and it doesn't become chametz, and it's fine. And that supervision is suffice for the sake of matzat mitzvah. In practice, what we should do is at the time of kneading, we try to fulfill both meanings of this ushmartem et hamatzot, this safeguarding. Meaning we should insist that Jews knead and bake the matzat mitzvah, taking care that the dough does not become hametz, and also having the proper intent for the proper kavanah for the sake of the mitzvah. However, at the time of harvesting, at the time of milling, just the first meaning is sufficient. Meaning a person only has to have in mind that a person only has to make sure that there's chametz prevention taking place. The wheat can be harvested by non-Jews, it could be milled by non-Jews or Jewish miners, as long as a Jew stands nearby and supervises their work. You don't have to have Jews actually there harvesting the wheat in the field. Just got to make sure that it doesn't become chametz. And those that are making matzot, lechatechila, he should say out loud before making it, when starting to work on the matzot, that this is being done leshem matzah mitzvat matzah. I'm performing this like a leshem yichud almost that we do sometimes before mitzvot. It should be said, I'm baking this, I'm kneading this dough now leshem mitzvat matzah. B'diavad, if he didn't say it, and as long as he thinks it, then it's fine. He should also have in mind that this is for the matzah of the mitzvah for the seder. But still, if he's had in mind that this is just for Pesach and didn't specifically say the seder, it's fine. I want to get into the discussion between handmade and machine matzah. Handmade and machine matzah. There's a great, great dispute amongst the poskim ever since the invention of matzah baking machines. And this dispute centers around two major principles. Number one, is there indeed no concern that machine matzah can become hametz? That's number one. And number two, can one use machine matzah to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on Seder night? Now, a lot of you listening right now, a lot of you watching us live, may eat machine matzah on the night of on the Seder. It is definitely the more popular one, and it is certainly the cheaper option. So, you probably want to hear what we're going to have to say tonight. I didn't welcome everybody at the beginning, but yes, welcome everybody that is listening live and listening in the future on the podcast, of course. So now, let's go back to the question. Those are the issues we have. Number one, is there no concern indeed with the machine matzah that they could become hametz? And two, can you fulfill the mitzvah of of matzah on the seder, of this matzah. So now, with regards to the chametz, everything really depends on the nature of the supervision and the machine. As long as there are kashrut supervisors who make sure that there's no risk of chametz, and then the matzot are kasher lePesach. That's it. There's no chametz. And even the most pious and God-fearing Jews, eat machine-made matzah on Pesach, as we will soon see. The second question, though, can you fulfill the mitzvah of matzah on Leil HaSeder with machine-made matzah? That one is very heavily debated. Some say that the mitzvah of guarding the matzah requires that the entire process of kneading and baking be done with explicit intent and kavanah leshem matzat mitzvah. Now, since a machine cannot have any intentions, the machine cannot think for itself, you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on the night of the seder with machine-made matzah. Who was saying the leshem ichud? Who was saying I have intent that this is for matzah? The machine? Machine can't talk. Most poskim maintain that one can fulfill the mitzvah by eating machine-made matzot for several reasons. Number one, like we learned, that some maintain that the mitzvah of guarding the matzah only requires us to ensure that it doesn't become hametz, and it's irrelevant whether this is done, whether making matzah by hand or making it by a machine or supervising the machine. As long as it doesn't become hametz, and that's it. Remember, we said that there were some people that's all we care about. More than that, a human being is the one that's operating the machine, and if he operates it with the intent of making matzat mitzvah, then automatically all of the machine's operations are considered to be done for the sake of the mitzvah. So what actually happens is that one can use machine-made matzah to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on the night of the seder. Many are very, very meticulous to eat handmade matzot that were baked under very, very good supervision, but it's not necessary to eat handmade matzah throughout the rest of the seder meal. But we always say that for the kezetim shel mitzvah, meaning the first time you eat matzah, the first bracha, and the korech and the afikoman, we should try to eat handmade matzot rather than machine-made matzah. Originally, I want to tell you just a little bit of the history that Rabbi Melamed brings down. It's really why I love his Sfarim so much. He says, originally the machines were operated with a lot more human input, which caused, believe it or not, concerns of chametz and of breaking from tradition. Now, after the machines were enhanced and improved, these concerns went away. The machines are a lot better, but the problem is the concern that operating the machine does not constitute kavanah. There's still no intent. And in fact, you probably have a bigger problem now that the machines are better and you have less kavanah going on, less intent. And therefore you have a lot of rabbis that prohibit outright the eating of machine-made matzah. Rav Shlomo Kluger, the Sanzer Rebbe, the Gerer Rebbe, and many, many great Hasidic leaders that of the yesteryear and many today do not permit eating machine-made matzah. Even today, they dismiss it. There are those that permit it. Ktav Sofer. Some poskim even prefer machine-made matzah over handmade matzah because there's less of a chance that machine-made matzah can become chametz. This is the opinion of the Or Sameach, Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, and Rav Shmuel Salant, the head of the Jerusalem Rabbinical Court. The main reason to prefer machine matzah is that the most important dimension of guarding the matzah is to ensure that it doesn't become chametz. And based on what they saw, machine matzah was least likely to become chametz versus that of human intervention. Says Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank very famously in his Sefer Mikraya Kodesh that since Gentiles and children are intelligent, they're smart, a supervising Jew cannot supply proper intent on their behalf while they need. A machine, on the other hand, has no intelligence, so therefore the intent of the Jew is actually effective, more effective than if the Gentile was making the matzah, or if the kid was making the matzah. According to Mordechai Eliyahu, which many Sfaradim follow his opinion that even though you could make a beracha on machine-made matzah, but handmade matzah is preferable, and that's how a person should go about on the night of the Seder. Many things have changed in recent decades. Machines are now more automated than ever, and therefore there's more grounds to be concerned that maybe there wasn't the proper intent, the proper kavanah for the sake of the mitzvah. Maybe in the past, when there was more human input, there were more buttons to be pressed, there were more things to be moved, it was necessary to operate the machinery. Maybe it was less of a concern. But today, the machine really operates at the touch of a button. And not only that, but when all of the matzah was handmade, there was a concern that the pressure to supply matzah to the entire Jewish world meant that matzah bakers were not meticulous enough in their efforts to keeping matzah from becoming chametz. The machines was a great solution to that issue. But most handmade matzah factories, the ones that are handmade, are very, very meticulous. You have to see them work. You can find videos of them on YouTube and see how fast and how quick they're doing it, to the point that it's probably better than machine-made matzah. Less of a chance. So the maaseh, of course, the machine-made matzah is kasher, and that's the reason why you are allowed to eat machine-made matzah. Is the reason why they sell it in the stores. But again, to fulfill the mitzvah on the night of Pesach, you want to do it in the best way, and you do that with handmade matzah, and that's why we go the extra effort. We spend a little bit more money. We buy the handmade matzot, Matza Shemura, Mishat Ketzira, from the time of harvesting. Those are the ones that you find in the stores. Yes, it's a little bit more money, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu rewards you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu pays you back the more money that you spend on the mitzvot, especially when it's a biblical mitzvah, all the more so. If you're going to go spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on clothing and new ties and new shirts, even though you already have ties and you already have shirts, but you spend all this money, which is also good for Simchat Yom Tov, why wouldn't you do it for matzah, which is the main mitzvah of the holiday? The last thing I want to speak tonight, and I spoke briefly about it this morning in the Shachrit Minyan, is based a little bit on what we spoke about, the concept of placing matzah, already baked matzah, in a liquid. You might have heard the term called Gebrokts. Gebrokts means soaked. The Ashkenazim use this. I want to explain what this means, where it comes from, and what is the Sephardic stance on Gebrokts, on soaked matzah. Is it permissible to take matzah on Pesach, put it in a liquid, such as a soup or a dip, or can I place sauce on one's matzah? A lot of people, my students talk about matzah pizza. Matzah pizza, this is the biggest thing. They can't wait. They love matzah pizza. They like it better than regular pizza. I don't know about that one, but they like it better than regular. So what does that mean? You take tomato sauce and you spread it on the matzah, and then you put the cheese. So that sauce is liquid. So can I do that? What are we worried about? So let's look at it more deeply. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Taf Samech Gimel, Seif Gimel, writes that one may boil fully cooked matzah in water on Pesach. You may do that. You're allowed to take matzah and put it and boil it. I guess it was a type of meal. However, there was a custom brought down by the Sha'arei Teshuvah that some individuals refrained from doing so by placing matzah in any liquid. And the reason for this custom was that there might be some dough in the matzah or some flour that had not been fully baked. And now, being that it comes in contact with a liquid, this will become dough and it will leaven. And especially if the liquid is hot, like a soup or boiling water, it'll leaven instantly. And you have now chametz. God forbid you eat chametz. Chametz asur afilu b'mashu. So this custom is actually noted by many, many poskim, including the first Rebbe of Lubavitch, Rav Shneir Zalman of Liadi, and it's also brought down by the Mishnah Berurah. And there are a number of Ashkenazi communities today who follow this practice and refrain from eating Gebrokts, what they call Gebrokts. Gebrokts literally means soaked, any matzah that comes in contact with liquid. So if you are from an Ashkenazi community that does not eat Gebrokts, matzah pizza is out of the question because the tomato sauce has liquid there and there's water in the tomato sauce. I don't think it's pure, and there must be some water content, and it will touch the flour and it can leaven, and that's a big problem according to those communities. Sfaradim, however, did not accept these stringencies, and according to Sfaradim, it is totally acceptable and permissible to place matzah and liquid on Pesach. This is especially true nowadays when our matzah is actually very thin, which makes it virtually impossible that there would be any unbaked flour in the matzah. When the Shulchan Aruch, when I quoted that law in Shulchan Aruch just a few moments ago, the Shulchan Aruch ruled very leniently with regards to matzah being dipped. At the time of the Shulchan Aruch, the matzah was very pita-like. It was thick. And there might have actually been a possibility that there was some dough left unbaked. But nowadays, the matzah that we eat is very, very thin. It's like a cracker. There is very, very little concern. There's no reason to concern, in fact, that you will have this problem with the thin matzah that we eat. I always say that, Shulchan Aruch talks about that the maximum thickness of a matzah on Pesach is the size of a tefach. It shouldn't be more than a tefach. A tefach is your fist. That means you were eating matzah that could have been up to 8 centimeters thick. Unheard of nowadays. And yet he still said you could dip that in boiling water. You could soak it. You have nothing to worry about. All the more so, look also can the matzah that we eat today. However, with that said, one of the great Sephardic poskim, Chacham ben Zion Abba Shaul, who passed away in 1998, in his Sefer R Eliezer, he writes that maybe there is room to be stringent in this regard when eating machine-made matzot. Machine-made matzot. Why the difference? Why machine-made? And he explains that in the factories which produce machine-made matzot, flour is spread very thinly in the air of the room. You don't even see it. You don't see it till you walk out of the factory. He observed that you see a guy that walks into the matzah baking factory, and when he comes out after a few hours, he's totally white. He's white. The flour that is being dispersed in the air is just landing on his clothing. The flour particles that are just flying in the air. So comes Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch rules that in a different place, that when you bake matzah, you should not add flour to the surface that you're baking. When you're kneading, you can't add flour because the flour that is on the surface can stick to the dough, and that flour might not bake fully. Okay, it might not bake properly in the oven and could potentially become chametz. So says Chacham ben Zion Abba Shaul that since flour particles are flying about in the factory as the machines mix the dough, some flour is likely to fall onto the surface of the dough after the kneading. And therefore he writes, those who wish to be stringent should refrain from placing machine-made matzah in liquid, because the flour which fell onto the dough before it was baked might not have been fully baked in the oven. He does mention that in all likelihood, it probably is of little concern, and probably all was baked. But he says, nevertheless, there's room to be stringent and to refrain from putting a machine-made matzah into a warm liquid, which would cause unbaked flour to become chametz. If a person did mix matzah with hot liquid, he writes that he should eat it very, very quickly, before the unbaked flour has a chance to become chametz. This is the opinion of Chacham ben Zion Abba Shaul. But we should note that Chacham Ovadia Yosef Zecher Tzadik Livracha, in his Sefer Chazon Ovadia, he draws no distinction between handmade matzah and machine-made matzah in this regard. He writes that it's entirely permissible to place even machine-made matzah in liquid of Pesach. We're not worried for flour that was left unbaked. We're not worried about the flour particles in the air. He is more standard when it comes to this. and Chacham Ben Zion is more lenient, and that is indeed how most Sfaradim practice today, that we are able to dip your matzah in whatever liquid. We do not hold of Gebrokts and the stringencies that come along with that. So we covered a lot today, Baruch Hashem, in part 1 of the laws of matzah. I'm happy you guys were able to join me tonight, Baruch Hashem. I invite you to join me next week as we delve into more laws about matzah in part 2 of the laws of matzah. I want to thank you everyone for joining us tonight on the Finding Holiness podcast. You can check out all the remaining shiurim and podcasts that we have on our website, findingholiness.com, findingholiness.buzzsprout.com. Don't forget to rate, review, leave your feedback. Always would love to hear. And of course, if you wish to sponsor a episode, contact me at findingholiness@gmail.com or through our website, findingholiness.com. Wishing everybody a wonderful night ahead. Be well. Take care.